So I'm going live on YouTube and Facebook here simultaneously.
Great.
And I think we are live in both places. Okay. Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Millikin from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And it is a real treat and honor to welcome my friend, Sarah Weinman, back to the little program here. Sarah, it is great to see you.
Likewise, it's good to be. I wish we could do this in person, but someday in the future, we'll be able to do that in person again.
Yeah, hopefully it won't be too much longer. We had a really fun time when The Real Lolita came out. Had a nice at the store. But let me give you the formal intro you deserve. So let's see.
Okay.
I like your new author photo too. That's great.
Thank Nina Subin. She's a genius.
Yeah, that's a great picture. Sarah Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita, A Lost Girl, An Unthinkable Crime, and a Scandalous Masterpiece, and the editor most recently of Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession. She is a 2020 National Magazine Award finalist for reporting and a Calderwood Journalism Fellow at the McDowell. And her work has lately appeared in New York Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, and the Washington Post. Weinman currently writes the crime column for the New York Times Book Review and lives in Gotham City.
Indeed.
Yeah. We talked. Yes. We had a fun little chat not too long after you got the New York Times gig, and you were talking about how it was a job that you were just kind of born to take.
Yeah, and now it's been a little bit over a year, and I still, I'm just trying to, what better thing than to read crime novels essentially for a partial living? It's great, and I get to discover new voices, and I get to reacquaint myself with old series that either I read a long time ago or I just had fallen off of. So it's great. I love it.
Isn't that one of the joys of book reviewing? You know, as you say, you get assigned books that, I don't know about you, but I'll get offered, like a whole slew, and they'll say, all right, do you think you might like this? And I've discovered some really wonderful books that way, just blindly.
Yeah, publicists pitch me on their whole lists, and I just try to keep as open a mind and as wide a breadth as possible, because I don't want to let my own sort of natural biases and preferences come into play, because the column is for as many readers of crime fiction as possible, and people read really widely, so I have to read even more widely than they do.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of, it can be tricky to kind of say, well, this might not be to my personal taste, but this is an excellent example of a well-executed whatever,
Yeah, luckily I've been doing this long enough that I have a pretty good compass for when it's not to my taste, but I know that it'll speak to other people.
Absolutely.
And then it's great when I might not have thought it was to my taste, and then it turns out it is. Those are some of the best discoveries.
Absolutely. I've had that experience too. Well, your new book, we were just talking a little bit before we got started, is this, sorry about the glare here, this remarkable piece of work, Scoundrel. Let me get the whole subtitle. How a convicted
I know, it's a mouthful.
persuaded the women who loved him, the conservative establishment, and the courts to set him free. And folks, you are in for a truly killer story, and just a fascinating, disturbing, and somewhat sad commentary on our history, isn't it?
This seems to be, this is yet another of the types of stories that I seem to gravitate towards. And I think what initially drew me was the connection between William F. Buckley and Edgar Smith, the murderer in question, the scoundrel in question, because I had known of a comparable case involving Norman Mailer and his mentorship and advocacy for the convicted murderer Jack Henry Abbott. And then when Abbott was released and he wrote the book called In the Belly of the Beast, the very day that it got a rave review in the New York Times, he was arrested for knifing a waiter in a bar, and would ultimately spend the rest of his life and die in prison. And Mailer got a lot of blowback and a lot of criticism for it. And so I'd known about the case even dating back to my teens. I think it was just very much in the cultural consciousness. But after I wrote the original magazine article that would have become The Real Lolita, I was looking for what to do next. And I had stumbled across this mention of Edgar Smith, who had killed a 15-year-old girl named Victoria Zelinsky in Bergen County, New Jersey, and how he ended up on death row and how William F. Buckley helped get him off of death row. And I was like, why don't I know this story? This seems to be even sadder and weirder and more awful than the Mailer Abbott saga. Why is this not as well known? So I started with that in the fall, end of 2014. It was a little bit later than the fall, and did some preliminary research and reporting and reached out to people. And one of them was Edgar Smith, because he was still alive and in prison. But what I came to realize in doing that initial research and reporting is it wasn't going to be a magazine piece. There was just too much material, and I didn't even have all of it yet. And then there were certain people, certain sources who just were really reluctant to go on the record with me as long as Edgar was still alive. And so at that point, it was like spring of 15, I was getting ready to finish production and the impending publication of the 2-volume set I edited for Library of America, Women Crime Writers. The next year I would sell the proposal for The Real Lolita, and that was my first book. So it really wasn't until I was finishing up the first draft of The Real Lolita in September of 2017 when the news finally broke, though I had kept some tabs, but there were obits in the Washington Post and the New York Times for Edgar Smith, who had actually died the previous March. And I learned about it a couple of months later, just because I would monitor the California Bureau of Prisons where he was incarcerated, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how it came to be from a timing standpoint. And once the obits were published, I checked in with my agent, because at that point I kind of knew that this was going to be my second book. And I said, well, he's dead now. I guess I should get this proposal ready. And it's like, well, how soon can you get it ready? And it's funny to say this, but it was kind of true. It was like I downloaded everything that was in my brain into a Word doc. And I think it was like dumping about 4,000 to 5,000 words pretty much like overnight. I think it took like 24 hours to do the really rough first draft of the proposal. And then there were lots of rewrites. So it didn't go to my editors at Echo and Knopf Canada, I think, until June of 2018. And once the book sold, then I was like ready to commit to it. And now we're in February 2022. And right, there was a little pandemic that happened as I was finishing up the first draft of this, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the really long-winded version of how Scoundrel came to be.
Well, we were discussing before we went live here about, can you talk a little bit about how you approached telling this story? You know, you give a very informative and excellent introduction, kind of broadly outlining the basic case, and talk about your strategy for the book.
Well, I think I should preface that just by saying that when I started on Scoundrel, the working title was The Convict and the Conservative, because at the time, I thought it really was going to be primarily about the relationship between William F. Buckley, the founder of National Review, and though at the time of their initial correspondence, he wasn't quite embedded in American culture in the same way that he would over the next few years, with the running for mayor in New York City and being on TV with his talk show Firing Line and his twice-a-week column on the right, and other means of his public intellectualism, the James Baldwin debate at Oxford.
All the Gore Vidal.
Yeah, Gore Vidal in the 1968 presidential conventions. So I thought it was just going to be primarily about that intellectual relationship, and the title obviously kind of refers to Janet Malcolm's The Journalist and the Murderer, because I felt like there were some interesting resonances between Buckley and Smith and Jeffrey MacDonald and Joe McGinnis, even though people think that Malcolm's book is specifically about that case. But I always viewed it as this is actually a warning and a template for other similar stories, though I never got a chance to ask her if she knew of this case, unfortunately. But as I worked on the book, and what actually made me realize that Scoundrel was a book, was finding the archives of Sophie Wilkins, who was the book editor at Knopf, who had read the Esquire piece that Buckley wrote about Edgar Smith and the case. And because he quoted extensively from their correspondence and included much from Edgar's letters, Sophie wrote Buckley saying, based on the letters, I think he has literary merit. Maybe if he's working on a book, I'd like to know about it. So that took a little bit of time. They started to correspond in the summer of 1967. And so in early 2016, I was doing some Googling, and I found a reference to Sophie's archives at Columbia University. I was like, well, her name has come up, and that's interesting. And it looks like there's extensive correspondence between her and Edgar. So I just went in there blithely thinking that it was strictly professional correspondence. And then within about 10 minutes, that was completely blown to smithereens. And I realized the veritable gold mine that I had, that essentially this was a correspondence that went completely off the rails. And within months, they were declaring love for one another. And then it got particularly
stuff, right?
Explicit. What?
So there's some kinky stuff in there, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, considering that Edgar mostly could not correspond with people, at least when the censors were noticing at New Jersey State Prison, he was only allowed to write on one piece of paper, both sides. But the way he got around it, and this was how he sent his racy epics to Sophie, is that if you sent material through your lawyer, the censors couldn't see it because it was privileged. So he just basically gave a sheath of documents to his state lawyer, Steve Lichtenstein, and Lichtenstein didn't even know what they were. And so that's how they would communicate. And this was something that he had pioneered when he would correspond with Buckley on more detailed legal matters. But anyway, so that's that was explaining how Scoundrel became a book, but I think that I may have lost track of what your initial question was.
Well, let's just for the people watching who are unfamiliar with the original story and the original case, he was convicted in, was it 1957?
Yeah, so the murder of Victoria Zelinsky took place on March 4th, 1957. Within 24 hours, the Bergen County Police and the prosecutors alighted on Edgar, who was 23. He was fairly recently married, the father of a 3-month-old baby. They lived in poverty in a trailer park. This is the kind of guy who, and I just actually recently learned this, when Patricia, his first wife, was giving birth to their daughter, Patty Ann, in hospital, at that point, you stayed multiple days in the hospital. So she was there, I think, 3 days. And then a friend drove her home to the trailer, and they found it was in complete shambles because he had been basically partying the whole time leading up to his wife and baby coming home. And he refused to clean up. So Patricia, who was just given birth to a baby, and her friend are essentially forced to clean up this trailer, which I just was like, this is the kind of guy he was. He was pretty shiftless, itinerant. He washed out of the Marines. He couldn't hold a job. He was prone to rages. He would sexually and just verbally and emotionally abuse his wives and girlfriends. So he was not a great guy, but he was also part of this world, and he knew Vicky slightly because she would go out on dates with one of his friends. And so when they would be in groups, sometimes he would end up giving rides home. And so he would give her a ride. And that's, of course, what happened on the night of March 4th, 1957, where she was walking back from her friend's house, and she was supposed to meet up with her sister Myrna at a agreed upon meeting point and then walk the rest of the way home together. Myrna got there, Vicky wasn't there because she had gotten into a car that Edgar was driving, and something terrible happened, and then she ended up at the bottom of a sand pit with her head bashed in.
And there's you really paint a vivid portrait of what her family went through that night and the next day, the father,
Yeah, I mean, after Myrna got back and they stay up all night and they go out searching, and then the next morning, her father, Anthony, is in the car and he sees like a bloody clothes and bloody scarves and a loafer, and is sort of following a trail, and that's how he discovers his daughter's body in the company of the police chief. So I mean, he was also not a great guy. I mean, there was a lot of domestic and abuse and intimate partner violence happening in that house. So I don't think Vicky had the greatest childhood, but that doesn't mean that she deserved to die so cruelly and abruptly and horrendously. I mean, she didn't have a chance to have a life. She didn't have a chance to be anything.
Right.
And so that's why I think this goes back to the structure of it. The reason why I essentially started at the end in the introduction and basically say Edgar Smith died in 2017 in prison, here's how he got there, and I kind of just lay out the whole story. I didn't want this to be a whodunit, and I didn't want people to have any doubt that he did it, because I was working on it and I never had any doubt that he did it. But what I wanted was a sense of how the hell did this happen? How did a case that maybe it wasn't a slam dunk, but it was pretty strong from a circumstantial standpoint, how did this fool people along the lines of William F. Buckley and Sophie Wilkins and other people? Like when Smith's book, Brief Against Death, is published, who reviews it for the New York Times Book Review? It's Ross MacDonald, who comes to the conclusion, well, based on this, he's made a pretty convincing case, so I can't know one way or the other whether he's guilty or not. So, if like Ken Millar is getting a little bit bamboozled here, that's particularly sophisticated manipulation.
Well, I mean, there's so much to discuss about the book, and it's quite an indictment of the what shall we say, the inequities of the justice system on so many ways, that well-connected white guy, essentially, at that particular point in time, too, in the 60s,
yeah.
Yeah, he got out in 70?
He got out in December of 71.
December of 71. Can you talk briefly about, so he is convicted. And by the way, here's a guy we learn early on, he will betray anybody. He will use anybody, orbit, including his best friends.
The fact that his defense was not only some other guy did it, which is a classic defense, but it actually names a one-time friend of his. This is someone who had dated Vicky on occasion. So he would just throw this guy under the bus. And then, because it was the 50s in pre-Miranda, things just operated very differently. So Edgar testifies in his own defense, which is pretty well frowned upon now. The most defense lawyers would not advise their clients to get on the stand and prove their innocence. But also the guy that is essentially slandered in court is also testifying and is held up. And so the prosecutor, after Edgar is convicted, has said, I had a double burden. It's not just that I had to prove that Edgar did it beyond a reasonable doubt, but I had to show that this other guy, Don Hamel, was innocent. And so that's a really tough thing to lay on a prosecutor. So Edgar's...
Also Hamel has that stain upon his reputation for the
and
rest
it ruined
of
his life. There's no question about it. I mean, the trajectory of his life, this was somebody who he tried out for the St. Louis Cardinals and it didn't go anywhere. And it might have if this hadn't happened. Right. And then he ends up just making a lot of terrible mistakes in his life. And unfortunately, I was not able to talk to him directly about it, but I can't blame him for not wanting to get into it. I mean, this is the worst thing that happened. And then because Edgar is proclaiming his innocence and writing books, it's like constant re-traumatizing over and over again, not just for Hamel, but also for Vicky's family.
Sure.
And her mom and her siblings got out, they left and went to California, but they couldn't escape the news. And their attitude was, we're just never going to speak about it. This is just something we really want to forget and just leave in the past. And that's an appropriate coping mechanism. Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, and as I said, since there really aren't spoilers per se, I'm just going to go all over the place, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, he gets convicted and he's sent to prison. So from that period, from 57 to when he is wrongfully exonerated in 71,
yes.
Tell us about what's going on. He's studying, he's educating himself. How does he make that initial connection with Buckley?
So that takes a few years. At first, Edgar was just preoccupied with avoiding the electric chair. And a year after his conviction, in August of 1958, he actually comes within half an hour of being executed. That's how close to the wire it was. And his first wife, Patricia, actually stays by him in those first few years. But it's roughly around when she finally leaves him. She's met a guy, they get married, they move to Colorado. Edgar tries to spin it as, he's the one who's filing for divorce and it's all very amicable. It's all bullshit. But by this point, he has decided that he will do everything in his power to live. He essentially takes many college classes and is reading all sorts of books, mostly nonfiction, but some degree of literature. But he's just going to turn himself into the best possible jailhouse lawyer and advocate for himself because he can't always afford lawyers. His mother, Anne Chupak, who I kind of wish I had gotten into more in the book, but the book was already huge enough that unfortunately, some people had to be devalued a little bit in the narrative, which is always unfortunate. But she believed in his innocence the whole time. And so he gives an interview to a guy who had been the PR director for the Ridgewood Sunday News. And Edgar first knew him because this guy was his high school gym teacher and always thought highly of Edgar. So they kind of stayed in touch. So at one point, Edgar talks about a prison official who has copies of National Review, along with other magazines and newspapers. And that prison official has been moved, so he no longer has access. And because Buckley is monitoring every press clipping, and because it's 1962, this isn't digital. It's like you are literally subscribed to a press clipping service and everything comes at you. So he gets this and is interested enough that he has a colleague at the magazine named Donald Cox, who had been a lawyer in Canada, but is now a journalist working at National Review. He has him look into the case. So that's how the correspondence begins in 62. There's an initial piece in NR in October of 63 that Cox writes. And after that, Buckley and Edgar continue to correspond, and Buckley seeds money for Edgar's legal defense fund. And then the tenor of the letters actually change from just strictly legal stuff to much more bonhomie and, what I think Buckley genuinely believed was a genuine friendship. He didn't really see that Edgar was kind of imitating his syntax and trying to sound more, Buckley called it Victorian prudery, which is patently not true. But Edgar was kind of changing his language to suit whoever he was corresponding with. So his letters to Buckley were very different from his letters to Sophie, which were very different from his letters to his lawyers and even individual lawyers. So really, he was whatever the other person wanted to see him as. He never really had a self. And that's common with people who are diagnosed with antisocial personality disorders who have some kind of issue like that, whether or not he's a psychopath or a sociopath. Like those are terms that other people can decide upon. I'm not a clinician, so I've never diagnosed the man, but I've read enough of the psychiatric reports that I feel like I'm confident in saying there was something very, very wrong with his personality. And the old idea of the mask of sanity, I think, really applied to Edgar.
He had that gift of charm, which is very common. And, as you say, the ability to kind of, that chameleon-like ability to put on the mask that was required for whatever circumstance. Yeah.
And yet there would be a disconnect between the Edgar of the letters and the Edgar in person, with which both Buckley and Sophie commented on. Buckley, even in his Esquire piece, noted that Edgar was a little bit taciturn, didn't want to talk that much. And then when Sophie met him, and this was after their letters had started to become very charged, she was so disappointed because he spoke in this, northern New Jersey accent that she just somehow wasn't expecting. He had bad teeth. He was surly. So she just felt wrong-footed. But then she kind of just put that aside and was like, whatever, maybe that was just a one-off, and the letters resumed. And there would be more pleasant visits between the two, but mostly wasn't that great. So I don't know. But at the same time, was he charming in the letters? Yes. And how do I know this? Because I'm sitting in the archives, both in Columbia, where Sophie's archives are, and at Yale, where Buckley's archives are. And I'm reading through the correspondence kind of, linear real-time fashion. And I can see myself kind of falling into Edgar's worldview. And I have to snap back, being like, no, I know the whole story. I know what happens here. And yet, if I, who knows all of this material, is still kind of being a little bit seduced by it, imagine how anyone coming cold to the story, maybe knowing a little bit from the newspapers, but if they're reading Brief Against Death in particular, which is it's a book that is well edited and is very persuasive, and I totally understand how that persuasion worked, but it's also a pack of lies. Or at least it's a lot of lies of omission. There's a lot of stuff that Edgar cherry picked or left out and the like. And even knowing that, I still felt like I was like being carried along in the narrative. So there is this propulsive pacing quality to it. And he never could quite replicate that in other books, especially in the novels that he wrote. But it's so interesting that it was there in brief and that people really kind of fell for it.
Yeah. Can you talk, when I was reading, I was very impressed with the way you, especially early on in the book, where you kind of recreate, kind of beat by beat what happens and what happens in the immediate aftermath of the crime, about how he and his friends with the car, with all these other details, the fact those telling details about how he gets a haircut right after the crime. How did you come up with all that good stuff? Was that a matter of newspaper reports at the time or interviews or?
So that particular chapter, which I think is chapter 2, it's almost exclusively drawn from trial transcripts.
Wow.
So I wrote it in the perspective of Joe Gilroy, who is no longer alive, but I was basing it on what he testified to and what others also testified to in court. And then there was a lot of great newspaper coverage, in particular by the Bergen Record and the Passaic Herald News, just the Northern New Jersey, the Patterson News. Thankfully, thank God for newspapers.com, because they would have full digital runs of the newspaper. So I remember it was like the summer of 2019. I'm at a friend's house and I have like 3 days, and I'm writing those opening sections of Vicky's murder and the trial. And I have newspapers opened up, and the way I had it configured is that I was trying to approximate what it would be like to read the newspaper every day. So I would just go through and look at, do search terms and then narrow it down to March of 1957, then April, and then May, and just track it day by day and only look at New Jersey and New York, because I felt like any other state would give me more like wire stuff, which was useful, but I wanted the primary sources. And with the trial transcript, what happened is after Edgar got out, because of the publicity and the controversy, the prosecutor's son, so the prosecutor was Guy Calisi, his son, Ron, who had attended the trial when he was 10 years old, which I just think is remarkable. And so he was outraged, and he was a young investigator himself. So he put together a book that contained more or less the complete trial transcript. Unfortunately, I was not able to come up with, a backup copy of the trial transcript that wasn't in this book, just because, a lot of time has passed and things get lost, and there was a pandemic. But this book, which is called Counterpoint, is over 1,000 pages long, because it is, or purports to be, the complete trial transcript. And so it begins with a little piece that Ron writes about attending the trial, and then it's all of the court testimony, a summary of the appeals, and then some other material that proved really relevant to me from a research standpoint. Ron died in 2016, but I was able to meet and talk with him, so he knew that I was working on this project. He had a lot of pointed things to say. He was super pro-death penalty, which was interesting. Huh. But I also understand why. I think that he grew up in having seen through his father some of the worst of the worst, and that really colored his worldview.
We'll get into because I see this book in almost like 3-act structure in some ways. But in the background, in my mind, as I was reading it, you really put Vicky front and center in this book, even though, here she is, she's almost frozen in amber at 15, and would you say that, as with the real Lolita, part of your intent in this book is sort of to give back to Vicky and the two or more other girls that feature into this book, which we can get into?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's why I wrote Scoundrel in a way that for those who are paying close attention, I'm never really in Edgar's head until the very end. And at that point, he, it's not really a spoiler, but after he got out, he had a few years of being free, and then the rage overcame him and the instability, and he remarried a much younger woman. They moved out west. He was the opposite of his success, and then he kidnaps a woman and comes really close to killing her, goes on the run, is arrested because he calls Buckley's secretary, Frances Bronson, who relays the message to Buckley, who calls the FBI, who find him in Vegas and arrest him. So he goes to trial. He's convicted. There's some possibility that he might be paroled. Those never come to be, and he dies in prison. So I wanted it that you are not in Edgar's head until he is stuck in prison for the rest of his life, because at that point there's no, he only has to reckon with himself. But until then, to my mind, he is the least interesting character in the book. I was much more interested in illuminating what happened to Vicky, what happened to Patricia's first wife, Paige, his second wife, Juliet Scheinman, who she also really fascinates me as a woman who read Brief Against Death and came to believe in his innocence and starts corresponding with him and would become his first, I guess, IRL girlfriend. But that also ended in some menace, and she manages to get away from him. But also, to me, there's no book without Sophie Wilkin. She is the beating heart of Scoundrel, because just the breadth and the depth of her letters and how wide-ranging they were, and sometimes they were exhausting. A lot of times they were exhilarating, but I really felt like I came to know her through her words, and I wanted to convey that as she became enmeshed and really fell down this terrible rabbit hole and became part of, I guess, a bizarre intellectual and emotional love triangle with Edgar Smith and William F. Buckley.
Yeah, that sort of trio or the kind of the heart of the book, provide that framework. What about Carol Chessman? Does he interest you in a same
I mean,
way?
I mentioned him. I know. I feel like I kind of dance around the edges with Chessman because, I mean, look, I'm Canadian, so if people want to ask if I'm pro or anti-death penalty, I'm just like, I come from a country where we don't do that. We don't do that. And I think that it's too expensive, and too many people have been truly wrongfully convicted who are on death row, that it just makes the whole enterprise suspicious. Yeah. Chessman, I believe, was the last guy to be executed who was not convicted of murder. He was convicted of sexual assault and robbery. And so I see, and he always claimed he didn't do it, but that's, from what I understand, not true. But because he had literary talent and wrote several books that were, the first one, I'm blanking on the title, but it was a huge success.
Cell Block something.
2355, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And that became a movie. So Chessman
the kid was a killer, wasn't that one?
Yeah, but yeah. He was the not the first, but like the first maybe famous death row incarcerated individual who wrote and received attention. But I mean, Jack Henry Abbott was not on death row, but certainly he got Norman Mailer's attention. Reuben Carter, Hurricane, had a song by Bob Dylan and other people advocating for him. I thought of like Dan Marlowe and how Al Nussbaum, the bank robber, got in touch with him and sort of was pretending that he was a fan and a writing student. And
right.
Marlowe was so entranced that he managed to help him get out. And I mean, I still think of Nussbaum's interview from jail or from prison of Donald Westlake, which is actually pretty good. It's in that nonfiction Westlake miscellany, The Getaway Car. And Nussbaum is also somebody who fascinates me because he got out and he becomes a member in good standing of Mystery Writers of America and is, going to SoCal meetings every month. And he's not only writing and publishing stories for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, but I was looking for this the other day, but at one point he was actually on the cover.
Nussbaum was? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'll be darned.
I know, like not as Nussbaum, but just like dressed up as some 19th century figure or something. And it's just like what was going on here? And it's something I really should ask Janet Hutchings, the editor, about, because I think she was there when this was happening. It's just one of these like it's on my to-do list and I've just keep forgetting. But
Well, the guy,
Larry,
Chuck Kelly, who wrote the Dan Marlowe biography, is a good friend.
that was so good.
Yeah, he's a really great, he lives here in Phoenix. Good
Oh,
guy.
did I know that? Because I think I met him at NORCon.
Yeah,
So
Chuck's great. He's an old time reporter and he really got a lot of great stuff.
yeah, no,
That
that's,
Marlowe story, not to digress, but that really has it all. You know, it's got
yeah, I agree.
amnesia, spanking, all kinds of good stuff.
He was a character, and then just the level of brain injury and dementia that he suffered was just awful.
Damn good writer too. Some of those.
Yeah. No, the name of the game
really,
is Death is just, I want to reread it now.
Yeah, classic.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that there were, and another one who I did talk to, and it was actually an interesting story because I felt like there was such a different, I had such a different reaction to him than I did from corresponding with Edgar. So this was Tom Tarantino, who in 1963, along with another man, they robbed a bar and there were cops there, and they took the cops hostage and made them strip to their underwear and then shot them and killed them. And then they went on the run. And so the other guy, the cops found him in New York and killed him, essentially. And then Tommy turned himself in. So he was on death row with Edgar and knew him. And eventually Tarantino's sentence is commuted, as everybody's was, when the death penalty was repealed for a short period of time on cruel and unusual punishment grounds in 72. And by the time it comes back in 76, well, they're not going to reinstate it. But he stays in prison and he's finally paroled in 2003. And there's a huge uproar because how could you parole a cop killer? But he moves to Camden. He gets into a little bit of trouble with drugs, but manages to steer clear of it. And I managed to track him down and talk to him. He was volunteering at some homeless shelter. I think that's kind of what his deal was. He was in his 80s. Wow. And I did, we didn't meet in person, but I just remember talking to him over the phone thinking, I don't think he's a sociopath. I feel like if I was in the same room with him publicly, I don't think I'd want to be in a room privately. But if we were, sitting in a coffee shop, I would feel okay. But if I ever met Edgar, like that honestly gave me like a creeping feeling that went up my spine. Like I just did not want to go there. And I never had to.
I couldn't help but make a parallel, and I was going to ask you about this, between him and a Ted Bundy kind of character. Bundy, in the sense that Bundy, represents himself in court. He has that degree of narcissism. Do you see any kind of through line there, or some similarities maybe?
I mean, in the sense that the Bundy who actually was kind of pathetic and shambling and disorganized and not the sort of attractive boogeyman who media alighted on. I mean, there were just so many mistakes in the case. Like, he escaped twice. I mean, how stupid, like, what were cops thinking? What were they thinking to just let him go like that? Like, it just, there just wasn't much attention paid. But I think the Bundy that has become a central fixture in media with so many documentaries and books and the like, it felt like we were losing track of what this was really about. And it was about all the women that he murdered and all the ones who he harmed. So the only time I felt like I personally wanted to write about Ted Bundy was when there was that documentary and the reissue of the book by his girlfriend, whom he was with when the initial spate of murders in Seattle were taking place. And she was trying to grapple with how she missed it all. And of course she missed it all, because these guys, they have the mask, and it's their life depends on fooling people. Their life depends on making you see something that isn't actually there, or gaslighting yourself into believing something that you shouldn't actually believe. Like, that's their whole MO. So for that documentary, I reread Liz, she called herself Liz Kendall. I reread her book, and I wasn't able to talk to her directly, but I talked to the documentarian, and I felt like I just felt like I had a better insight into Bundy. So between that and the piece that Sarah Marshall wrote for The Believer that I reprinted in Unspeakable Acts, and I just felt like it's really important to kind of strip the glamour from serial killers.
Yeah.
And by the same token, though Edgar was not a serial killer, I think a lot of the same personality traits apply. It's just he had a lot of rage, he got angry, he took it out on women when he had the chance to rape, assault, and in some cases murder them, he did.
Well, yeah. And then let's talk just for a moment about Lisa. Is it Osborne? Is that how you
Husband,
say it?
yeah.
Tell us about her.
So she worked for, she was, I believe, a seamstress at a clothing store, emigre from Turkey, and married, several kids, in her early 30s, never had seen Edgar before in her life. And she was on her way to be picked up by her husband, and Edgar approaches with the car and just grabs her. And there ensues a struggle. He stabs her a bunch of times, but she fights and manages to kick out the windshield and steer the car and get it to pull over to the side of the road, and other cars are approaching, and she manages to tumble out with the knife still in her, and Edgar guns it and takes off. So she managed to save her own life, which is phenomenal, and she kind of described it as like an action movie. And so as a result, when I was trying to recreate this, and I was doing this from, again, newspaper accounts and especially the trial transcript, which I was able to obtain because they were in Buckley's archives. He wrote about everything and the aftermath for Life magazine in 1979. So he had all this material that was still sitting at Yale. So I'm reading through the trial transcript and sort of feeling my blood pressure rising. And I wanted that sense because, I wrote a crime book. Like there's a lot of intellectual history. There's a lot of publishing gossip. There's a lot of character analysis and character development. And that was all, of course, really important. But I use the techniques of crime fiction because I want people to keep reading. I want the sense of that the story matters and these people are important. And so, yeah, I wanted the sort of visceral sense of what was going on as much as was possible in sort of recreating both Vicky's last days and her murder, but also, trying to tread a fine line where you're trying to recreate, but you're not trying to sensationalize.
Right.
And it's something I grapple with, and I think it's good that I grapple with it and will continue to, because I never want to veer into the, outright lurid and exploitative fashion.
Right. And well, let's see, we got a little bit of time left. And by the way, people are watching on Facebook and YouTube. I'm flying solo here. So if you have any questions for Sarah, please don't hesitate to put them in, and I'll go back and forth and check on those and see what we have. I'm interested in, can you talk a little bit about, okay, so we covered the period where he gets arrested. He gets, through the intercession of Buckley and others, he is exonerated and released in 1971.
Yes.
And then he goes on to become this media darling, appearing in all these TV shows, and he ultimately publishes a total of 5 books.
Right. I mean, the 5th book would not appear until many years later, which it was more or less self-published, but certainly Brief Against Death came out in 1968. He publishes a novel, Reasonable Doubt, in 1970. He gets out, and a couple of months later, he publishes a pseudonymous thriller called 71 Hours under the name Michael Mason. And that book is just flat out bad. I mean, A Reasonable Doubt is bad for a lot of reasons, mostly to do with it really is too lurid, and it really just, paints the Vicky's avatar in this horrible, misogynistic, gross way, especially if you know that this is a book written by her murderer. But the book that he publishes in the aftermath of Getting Out, that he had been working on in prison, is called Getting Out. And yeah, I mean, 1972 and 1973, he is giving public, he's a public speaker for criminal justice conferences, media events. He goes, I found this after the book was done, but for Getting Out, he talked to Studs Terkel. And that was a very strange conversation. I mean, I love Studs, like he was brilliant, but he wasn't that probing about Edgar. He just sort of accepted a lot of the stuff at face value, which I thought was interesting. I think really the only talk show that he didn't go on was Cavett, and that's, I don't know why. That's interesting to me. But right, also concurrently at this time, even though Edgar has some literary celebrity, it's already starting to be on the decline. And his ability to get work fades. He borrows money from Buckley and doesn't pay it back. And Buckley kind of has to cover a loan. And so Edgar kind of ghosts him for a while and doesn't really emerge until after he's married his second wife, Paige, and they've moved out west. So there's like a little bit of friction, and he treats Sophie pretty badly after getting out too, so she doesn't really have anything to do with him. And there was a very interesting letter that Edgar wrote maybe a year or so before getting rearrested, essentially saying, here I am in San Diego, I have a wife, I'm having trouble getting work, and everything seems to be drying up. I'm feeling a lot like I did in the late 1950s before everything happened. I'm like, foreshadowing.
Ding, ding, ding. Red flag.
Yeah, kind of like that.
So he is ultimately, arrested, thanks to Buckley, which is kind of a nice poetic ending to that story, kind of. But a few things I wanted to touch on. Were you able to find any indication that there were any other attempts at violence in the 70s before he was arrested? Or was that the only one that you could find a record of?
That was the only one I could find a record of. I mean, there was Edgar talked a lot about like getting mixed up with drug dealers. And the truth is, it's impossible to verify. And, my own feeling is that a lot of what he wrote to Buckley in that time about his life in San Diego was pretty bullshit. Yeah. But it's just impossible to know one way or the other.
And when did Lisa Osborne, is she still alive or did she pass?
She died in 2019. So I was not able to speak with her, which is unfortunate. But the truth is, after Edgar went to prison, she got on with her life. Her husband died. Her kids are still around. Like, she was just an ordinary civilian who suffered a terrible trauma and nearly lost her life. And so I'm glad that she was able to live out her years with what I hope are some degree of peace.
Right. Getting back to Buckley for a second, was there, and I know the answer because I've read your book, but was there a sense of, oh man, I've been duped, I've been conned by Buckley?
I mean, he would have said that he wrote an entire piece for Life magazine that addressed all that.
Right.
The answer was a little more complicated because in the immediate aftermath of Edgar's arrest, he did have a conversation with a lawyer who had worked on Edgar's legal defense a little bit later on for Supreme Court stuff and, stayed friends with Buckley. So Buckley did express some regret and remorse and guilt about it. But mostly after the Life magazine piece, he never talked about it publicly and really didn't talk about it a lot privately. Like, one of the people who I reached out to while I was working on Scoundrel was the late Wall Street Journal theater critic Terry Teachout, who was a friend of mine. And he moved to New York basically because Buckley had read his writing and became something of a mentor to him, which he did with a lot of younger writers of particular conservative bent. And so I asked Terry, did he ever talk about this case? He's like, well, I knew about it, but no, Bill never discussed it. So I think the only person he really had an outlet to speak about it, except maybe, as his son Christopher told me, maybe he talked about it in the confessional, because Buckley's Catholic, and I think that's important to note, that his particular type of Catholicism, I think, informed how he wanted to see people, for good or for ill, why he was not only duped by Edgar, but also took other, sort of shady-ish people under his wing. But it's also important to know who were the people that he tended to view as those he should mentor were young white men. So who are, had some degree of privilege. So I think that's just important to say off the top. But mostly he talked about it with Sophie. So there were several letters through the years, especially when Edgar was in the news or when there would be parole hearings, or when Edgar self-published this book and got in touch with Buckley. And so they had one last flurry of correspondence in 1998, and then that was that. But the way I described it in Scoundrel is that he and Sophie were like survivors of a shared war that no one else shared.
I was going to ask, what was, because I was just writing down some notes. I think Sophie died in what, 2003?
2003, and then Buckley 5 years later.
2008. What was the tenor of that last conversation, correspondence in 1998?
Edgar had written this historical book called A Tale of Old San Francisco. And because he had relied on research dating from the 60s, and I think because Sophie had suggested to him that it was a good idea, and he finally was able to get those research notes back and finish the book. So he wanted them to know, hey, I have a book out. Do you want to read it? And so Buckley sends a memo to Sophie, to Jack Harley, that lawyer I mentioned, to Steve Human, who was the lawyer working on the Supreme Court stuff, the federal courts, who also, interestingly enough, remained pretty close with Buckley until the end of their respective lives. Human died in 2012. And there was a joke that he would essentially be the executor of Bill's estate. I don't know if that ever happened. I don't think it did. But so he sends a memo just saying, I've heard from Edgar. He has a book out. I'm going to answer his letter. You can do what you want. So he answers the letter, and then Edgar expresses some degree of contrition. I don't know how genuine it was, because I don't think he was fully able to even get there and really express true remorse. But he did at least make an attempt to make some kind of amends with Bill, especially because after the Life piece, this was their last correspondence until then. Edgar wrote a really nasty letter to Buckley, just being like, this piece is terrible. You're a turkey. Why are you relying on my ex-wife? It just really, really nasty stuff.
Wow. Boy, I just had another point that I kind of lost. There's so much to it. There's so much to ask. Yeah, I mean, we could get into, what your research kind of revealed about the state of prison culture in the 70s in particular. I'm interested in, because it seems to me there was that point in the late 60s to maybe the late 70s where there was much more of an emphasis on rehabilitation, and then sometime then it turns into more of a punitive.
Oh, I mean, we can date exactly. It was when the death penalty came back on the books in 76. That's when things started to turn. And then when Reagan was elected in 1980 as like the law and order candidate, and then the crack epidemic came and crime went on the rise, and mass incarceration really just became out of control. And so here we are, where, like, I think it's pretty clear that excessively punitive measures, they don't really work in the way that people want them. It's just, I think a lot of people try to take some comfort that, oh, well, a bad guy is behind bars and we never have to think about him again. And meanwhile, the conditions of American prisons are just horrendous. And it's not just in the South. I mean, here in New York City, the main jail, Rikers Island, is basically like a humanitarian hellhole. And the previous mayor had been saying that it was going to close, and now we have no idea. And it's, the current guy, jury's out on what he's going to actually do. I don't have a lot of faith in anything to do with him. But
I've heard that San Quentin is closing. Have you heard that?
I had not heard that, but I know that they were so rampant with COVID that I think it just became a major crisis. But I mean, the podcast Ear Hustle, which comes out of San Quentin.
No, I don't.
It's a wonderful podcast. It's it's done inside. The hosts are, well, Earlonne Woods was in San Quentin, and then he got clemency and was released. And his co-host Nigel Poor was teaching art and running the media lab, working with prisoners. So now there is a third co-host, Rashawn New York Thomas, who I think may have also had a sentence commuted. I don't quote me on that. But the point is that it's a wonderful podcast about what it's like to be a prisoner, and just, it really, like, listening to that really helped me just kind of understand where things are at now. And, just reading books like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. Like there's so much, and reading abolitionists. There's a lot out there, and obviously I just want to keep reading and listening.
Yeah. And out here in the Southwest in particular, that whole kind of the epicenter for the prison for profit kind of culture. I mean, we get into all that horrible, warehousing
That's a whole other book.
nonviolent offenders, and I don't know. So many people have written about that. Let's see here. What else I got for you? Anything else? This interrogation.
I mean, we are running about an hour in, which
I know. I know. It's just such a fascinating book, and there's so much to talk about. I was intrigued by, I'm always looking for the telling detail. And was it Buckley who asked Truman Capote for a blurb? And
yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so when Brief Against Death was being prepared for publication, Buckley and Sophie reached out to Truman Capote because he was the guy, having just published In Cold Blood. There was the Black and White Ball. He was working on it. He had sort of become a de facto criminal justice pundit, which is just amazing to think about in hindsight. So he was the natural guy to read this book because he had been interviewing other prisoners on death row. And so he reads Brief Against Death and writes, okay, I read it and I was, very captivated by it, but I can't blurb it because to me, he's clearly guilty, but I'd like to write something where I just say that. And so, your choice. And they wanted him to write that piece because they felt like it would garner publicity. I don't believe he ever did. I do know, because I was working in his archives last year, that he had a storyboard for a documentary that is sitting in a vault somewhere. It was supposed to air on ABC in '68, and it got pulled for being too dark. So it had like one screening at the Rizzoli Theater in New York, and then that's it.
Wow.
It's never been seen again. But he was hoping to interview Edgar for it, but the New Jersey State Prison was like, no media requests, blanket rule. Buckley got in basically as part of the legal team. Sophie was able to write as a friend or as, I think, a cousin. And so, but Capote had no shot, and he was already talking to like lots of other death row prisoners. But that's a big what if. What if he'd met Edgar?
Well, can't you imagine, because they were on a lot of the same talk shows in the 70s. I mean, Capote was a fixture.
Capote was on Firing Line. You can also find that on YouTube.
Wouldn't that be awesome to find them both on the same show?
Yeah, there's a Firing Line episode of Buckley talking to Capote about capital punishment. It's a really fascinating episode.
With Smith on the show as well? Or no?
No.
No. That would be too good to be true.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, the question that's coming in here are, Paula Mounier, our good friend writer.
Oh, yeah.
She says, how do you choose your projects, or do they choose you? Good question.
I mean, to say that they choose me is a little like woo-woo, but I just feel like what I have found is that if it's something that I think about for years and it just won't go away, that's what I end up pursuing. So, I mean, it took from end of 2014 to now to work on Scoundrel. With The Real Lolita, I think I initially started in 2013-ish, and then it was published in 2018. So there's a fairly long gestation period.
Let's see here. Okay. Chris, he'd like to know, and this is something I was going to ask you too, what are you working on now?
So the immediate next project is a follow-up to Unspeakable Acts. So it'll be another true crime anthology. If for those who have read Unspeakable Acts, it's in 3 sections, and the last section is sort of a broader examination of the criminal justice system and rethinking what we would call true crime stories. So I basically want to do more of that. And so I've got a little bit of time, but I have to sort of figure out what pieces are going to be included and who's going to be the guest editor. But I'm excited to put on my editing hat anew. And then I'm afraid I can only take one more question after this.
All right, let's see. Here we go. All right, one more question. Dang, Sarah. Okay, when will we see a Sarah Weinman novel?
I have several in the drawer from when I was far younger. I think, especially now that I'm reading so much crime fiction again for the column, I find writing novels so much harder than nonfiction, because nonfiction, I have material, I can talk to people, I have, facts at my disposal, and I can use all the techniques of fiction to kind of make it feel, more captivating and compelling and all of that. And with fiction, I just feel like I'm bombarded with endless choices that I can make. So I think until I find an idea that I can just be like, is this something I want to spend several years on and just do it? But that hasn't happened. And part of it is just I keep finding new nonfiction projects to work on. But I never rule it out.
I'm sure we'll see one someday. But in the meantime, everybody, thanks so much for tuning in this afternoon. And thank you, Sarah. Congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure, as it always is, to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Remarkable book, folks. Go out and buy one. And Sarah, we'll stay in touch.
We certainly will. We have so much more fiction to catch up on.
Absolutely. All right.